The next presentation is by Jelena Durkin. She's Associate Professor at the University of Rijeka, the Faculty of Hospitality and Tourism Management, and she will give us some highlights on how this could be branding of the destination.
Thank you very much. Allow me for a little bit informal introduction into this presentation. When we were approached by University of Trieste and got invited to be a partner in the consortium on the project site, we were a small research team, and the field of accessible tourism and inclusive tourism, as well as application of universal design, was not something that we were extremely familiar with. So our first big activity on this project was to create a report on promotion and branding of accessible and inclusive tourism destinations. But before the step of promotion and branding, we had to dive really deep to understand what actually accessible and inclusive tourism is. And as every academic, we found lots and lots of information. We find lots of discrepancies and general lack of systematic approach to this topic. So there are many reports, many manuals, many great examples, but the systematic approach to the development of this topic is still lacking. So of course, as any academic, our main idea was, okay, let's make a book. So at this very moment, our book titled Breaking Barriers, Designing Inclusive Tourist Destination is in the process of publishing, and we are hoping that it will be available in 1 month, and it's going to be in Croatian and in English, and of course it will be completely free, available online. So this presentation today that I'm giving on some general elements of inclusive and accessible tourism and how to promote it actually contains only some insights and glimpses from this book. Since we didn't know exactly who is going to apply to listen to this webinar, these presentations also had to be a little bit universal in its nature. So my idea is to just briefly introduce you with the concepts of accessible and sustainable tourism, to give you some overview or some idea who, where, and how should develop this type of tourism offer, and again maybe to repeat or to introduce you again with some benefits of developing such offer in tourism. Let's start with a little bit controversial question. So is tourism really a right or a privilege? Barbara was telling us something about a right to access as one of the human rights. But what about tourism? Is tourism really a right or a privilege? When we think from the aspect of an average person, the mythical creature, as Barbara calls us, so taking into account the way of living, the modern way of living, the work restrictions, the family responsibilities, some personal responsibilities, of course, financial and economic constraints, I think we could agree that tourism is a privilege. And the privilege of living in developed countries also give us the opportunity to experience tourism, let's say to a little bit more significant extent, but again as a privilege. If we look at the Global Code of Ethics for Tourism as one of the documents very relevant for future sustainable development of tourism, they state in Article 7 that if we think of tourism as discovery and enjoyment of the planet's resources, then yes, every person should have a right to experience tourism and to become part of it. Moreover, in this same article, the special emphasis is given to family, youth, student, and senior tourism, as well as the tourism for people with disabilities, that they all should be encouraged and facilitated. Now, the question is, if we all, let's call us average people, have certain constraints and issues with engaging into tourism activities, it's really hard, but I think a little less harder after this webinar, to imagine what kind of challenges and issues have people that additionally have certain disabilities that are making their travel plans, travel arrangements even more challenging. So in order to understand them and to try to provide a more inclusive tourism offer, it's important first of all to understand the terminology. We are constantly, sometimes interchangeably, using two terms: sustainable, inclusive tourism and accessible tourism. There is a difference between them, and it's important to understand that difference. So first, we have accessible tourism. Let's say this is an entry level. So the first step of creating something more inclusive is to make it accessible. Accessible meaning, in terms of tourism, to make travel and tourism offer available to all by removing mainly physical barriers. So now we are considering those barriers that have multiple forms and understandings in this very basic manner, like something physical that is preventing people with certain disabilities, either permanent or situational, to enter to something, to access to something. When you manage to make tourism offer accessible, the next step and the bigger concept is to try to create inclusive tourism. You can consider accessible tourism being a hardware, and inclusive tourism is part of the bigger story. So let's say it's hardware accompanied by the software, making that when you create inclusive tourism, you are not only making travel accessible, but you are creating welcoming and accommodating environment for all the people of different abilities and different backgrounds. Because let's be honest, we don't engage in tourism because we have to. We engage in tourism because we want to experience something new. We want to be happy during this experience. And just the mere fact that something is accessible to you doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to feel comfortable while you access it, while you visit it. Maybe the good example are the food allergies that were mentioned in the previous presentation. Restaurants can have a list of meals that are actually lacking some of the critical ingredients, but the feeling towards the people who are actually ordering this type of meals and have lots of questions, does this food contain this or that, can be different. And if you don't have a welcoming environment, you could feel a little bit, let's say, not so happy in that restaurant, regardless of the fact that you have an access to the food that you need or that you want. Similar is with the relationship with inclusive and accessible tourism on all levels. So even though this presentation doesn't contain examples, you will get the chance to hear some examples afterwards, I would like to just make it a little bit less abstract. What does it mean to actually implement accessibility into tourism activities? Here you can see three main groups that we are divided the tourism system, so that you can see what does it mean to apply this physical accessibility on them. So we have infrastructure, facilities, and public spaces, where it's very important to remove or not to build any physical barriers and to ensure that there are step-free accesses, ramps, clear signage everywhere in multiple formats, where possible to be able to access to audio guides, some tactile elements, and of course accessible seatings. And of course accessible restrooms are very important in this group of elements. Then we have something even more specific for tourism. These are accommodation and hospitality services. When we are talking about provision of rooms with roll-in showers, grab bars, visual alarms, and other forms of accessible furniture, as well as digital and software arrangements, and availability of assistive equipment, of course. And finally, we have digital accessibility and information. This is the topic that is becoming more and more important every day. And it's becoming not so much anymore something that you can choose or you can, have it voluntary as expression of your sustainability or accessibility, but it's becoming a norm and a regulation. More precisely, we are talking about compliance with web content accessibility guidelines that became mandatory on the EU level. And the importance is especially because it applies also to many, many activities and sectors directly related to tourism. So here we are talking about that information itself has to be accessible and understanding to a very large number of people. In terms of tourism, apart from the general information, it is also important to have easy-to-use customer support channels so that people with different types of preferences, needs, and interests can relatively easily and directly approach and ask about what they're interested in. Okay, who's going to do all that? So, generally, it is a question, who is responsible for creating accessible and inclusive tourism offer? Theoretically, the change should come from public sector in terms of the change that is related to the accessibility and inclusion in general, not just in tourism, but in providing environment accessible to all, meaning all inhabitants, all local residents. And then this positive change can and probably will then affect also on tourism services. So let's start with the public sector. Here we have policymakers and planners, along with tourism authorities on all levels. what should they do? They should design and implement legislation and regulation in order to, let's say, nudge a little bit from theory to practice these wonderful initiatives in all fields regarding the accessibility, so that more and more things, let's call it like that, become mandatory. Another thing related to public sector is urban and destination planning, where in order for certain public site or destination to be truly inclusive, it has to be very carefully and detailedly planned. You heard some challenges that designers and architects have in that field. So this is very important to constantly rethink and not to allow new investments that are not from the scratch being already accessible and inclusive, but follow some other rules, and then later you will need additional funds to make them more accessible. Finally, there is a carrot in the story, or at least there should be a carrot in the story, meaning that public sector should think about certain funding and incentives for all those SMEs, private sector stakeholders from tourism, but also from other sectors which are interested in providing such type of inclusion and accessibility into their services. So they should also be additionally rewarded in some kind. Speaking of private sector, of course, they carry most of the tourism supply. So here we talk about hospitality providers, meaning owners of hotels, other accommodation types, restaurants, etc. But also, since tourism is a huge system, we are talking about providers of all other products and services that are directly or indirectly related to tourism. All of them need to think on how to invest in the new or how to renovate existing infrastructure and facility design in order to become more accessible. And again, the task for all of them is to provide as well accessible information, so that anybody who is interested in visiting some destination, some particular facility, can have up-to-date and clear information on what is going to welcome him there. So what is going to happen on site. Many of the information, regardless of the beautiful possibilities of internet, are often incorrect or they are dated. So the people without any disabilities have issues with that. And people with disabilities, this is one of the things that often discourages them from the travel. Not to forget, there is a third group. Those third group are people, let's say, there are people on the front. There are people who actually work with visitors, with tourists, with guests. They can be employees working in hospitality, but they can be employees of all other public institutions, national parks, other sites that people are visiting. They are the key to creating that welcoming and inviting environment and make it inclusive for all. So regardless of the fact that empathy is important, that those people have empathy in general, without very specific training on disability awareness and communication skills, there is a high chance that there will be some uncomfortable situations that might, like I said, discourage people, maybe not from traveling, but from visiting that particular destination, from creating a loyalty towards certain destination, from recommending it forward. And it's a really, really shame, because if one of the elements of this system doesn't work, then you really, really have a problem. And often these employees are being neglected, especially in nowadays when the situation regarding the workers in tourism is very, very difficult and very challenging. Okay, so where to start from? How to create more accessible and inclusive tourism from what we have already now? The idea is that you never focus on the product, only on the process. It's the same as it is with the innovation, the same it is as the learning, the provision of safety. So it never ends, actually. You cannot imagine that this is a steep hill and you climb it, and then you stand next to this lovely flag at the top and you're over. You conquered the hill, you became inclusive, and your job is done. Unfortunately or luckily, it's a process. It's a never-ending process that has its break, it has its viewpoints, some lovely moments when you actually make a step towards greater level of accessibility and inclusion, but it's something that needs to be constantly improved and constantly being done as a permanent activity. What else? When we talk about universal design and its unique approach and great useness that can have in tourism, it can and it should be applied whenever the new infrastructure, products and services are being created, because that's the best way, that's the best moment when you want to actually implement something that is already innovative, already accessible, and already provides you some elements for future inclusion. Similarly to ecological awareness and general sustainability awareness, very often public as well as private sector investors don't take into consideration these elements. They take into consideration the laws and regulations and then take them as something they have to mandatory apply. But all these additional elements somehow, falls out of the equation. And then later on what happens that you need additional expenses in order to what has already been invested in and built make more accessible. Another thing is, especially in tourism, there are many sites during its historical, cultural, or natural environment that are inaccessible or very, very hardly accessible. And it's not really possible to make them completely accessible without disrespecting their integrity. So in all those situations, when your hands are a little bit tight, there is a notion of so-called reasonable adjustment, meaning that the existing elements can also be rethinked and reconsidered in order to expand their accessibility. Not maybe to all, but to some additional and new groups of people, therefore making more inclusive sites, more inclusive attractions. Okay, how to do it? In the book, we proposed a very simple 3-step framework that applies to everybody who wants to develop accessible and inclusive tourism, regardless of are they from private sector or they are destination planners, destination organizations. Those steps seem very easy. First, you need to improve usability of your existing tourism products and services. This is so-called pre-step. Then the idea is that you do as much as you can to enable accessibility and ensure the inclusiveness. And final step that is often forgotten is that you integrate the elements of the offer and their new accessibility and promote this new tourism offer in accessible manner. To just give a little bit of elaboration of each step, improvement of usability is very important because if we see the needs of modern tourists, this is something that is prerequisite for competitiveness in general in tourism. You shouldn't stay behind with modern trends, especially when we talk about application of ICT in tourism. It's, let's say, condition sine qua non today in general, but especially also if we are talking about people with disabilities, because the existence of assistive technologies that they often use is also making them a little bit more dependent on these digital services and technologies that providers use. So they need to adapt these new needs on the market. When they do that, step 2 is to try to parallelly, or one after the other, enable physical accessibility and ensure this inclusiveness through the desired experience and welcoming feeling for all. When we talk about enabling physical accessibility, our first association always are impairments related to mobility. So we see people in wheelchairs and we are finding the ways to make as much as possible sites accessible to them, which is basically okay and very good. But it's important also not to neglect this whole ecosystem of different types of disabilities, as well as the special needs that elderly people have, the needs of families with many children, the needs of pregnant women. And this is again why universal design offers solutions that are in start already more accessible to all, without some additional improvements. This is not easy task, this is quite difficult, so it's important to know that small steps are always okay. One by one, depending on financial resources, depending on some other specific context, it is important to constantly move forward. It doesn't have to be huge investments, just a little things and this awareness of the different types of people and their different needs. The final step is integration and promotion of everything that has been done. This is important because often people do invest a lot into more accessible tourism offer and then let's say they don't promote it adequately. They don't cooperate with networks of people with different impairments. They don't use them to test these new solutions. They maybe think it's okay what they've done, but they cannot be sure unless they really involve the specific target group. And here is also the element of education of employees and providers on how to communicate, how to approach to people with potentially certain disabilities, and how actually to provide them this welcoming and useful environment for all. When we talk about promotion, here we are, branding and promotion, there is something very important to emphasize, and those are labels. Labels are a great tool when we talk about providing some standardized and reliable information to tourists, so that they can rely upon that if you have certain label, you actually provide what that label stands for. It's also important to have a label to demonstrate that you are among the best practices within your industry. When it comes to accessible tourism, some overall international label is not actually at the moment doesn't exist. There were some attempts, but the corona put it on hold and we are still waiting for them. But we analyzed over 20 different types of labels dealing with accessible and inclusive tourism throughout Europe, and we found many interesting examples which either focus on, let's say, only hospitality, meaning hotels, restaurants, campsites, or they actually focus on some particular sites such as beaches. We have great examples of labels in Portugal as well as in France. And we have something called the hidden disability sunflower scheme. I'm especially emphasizing this scheme, this label, because it also has a huge educational purpose. Not just the labeling system, but the entire idea is that there are 60 to 80% of people with disabilities whose disabilities you don't see at first. And this is a great way to understand this topic a little bit more. And in Spain, there is also Hola Familia for the families, which means that they really systematically approach to this topic as well. I don't think it's very relevant to come again to go through the economic benefits of developing accessible and inclusive tourism. I think most of these points were covered by Katarina in previous presentation, but here you can see that from economical point of view, there is a big potential for revenue generation, especially potential for development of year-round tourism, meaning that people with disabilities or in some specific situations are not oriented on the peak of the season. They prefer to choose other periods of the year, which is very good for tourism development. And of course, accessible and inclusive tourism enhances the reputation and gives the competitive advantage to those destinations and facilities that manage to properly implement it, which overall increases the economic sustainability. But it's not all in the economics, it's not all in the money. Here are also huge social benefits from developing inclusive tourism. This is particularly for the host communities, because all those public infrastructure that is being developed using universal design to be more accessible, more inclusive, is of a great use for local residents as well as for the tourists. That's why we have this increased community well-being and in general increased social sustainability. This directly contributes to the 3 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were posed by the United Nations. What to conclude after this all? I don't have a very formal conclusion. I would just like to point you to the quote of Bertrand Russell, who said that freedom in general may be defined as the absence of obstacles to the realization of desires. This actually means that if we make an effort to remove some or most of the barriers to the development of inclusive tourism, we are actually contributing to the achievement of freedom for, as you can see, significant number of people with disabilities who are interested in traveling. And having in mind the aging and the demography trends, we are actually developing tourism for us all. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and of course I'm at your disposal for any questions and additional discussion at the end of this webinar.